What has happened to the lesbian community in recent decades?
To have a lesbian community, you need to have separate spaces for women and lesbians. And in the 1980s, lesbian feminists created a community. It was political, and they had their own house in Oslo for women. When the house was taken from them, the community no longer had a meeting place. And then the community vanished. The next generation could meet at a lesbian club called Potta in the 1990s, and early 2000 in Oslo. But after it closed, we no longer had our own place. So the young generation of lesbians today have no place of their own in Norway. Actually, women don't have any place on their own. And this is because if you're a lesbian and disagree with what the lesbian gay organization, as they were called before, now it's like queer organizations, then you are a target. The lesbian organization, they want to demonize you and call you hateful if you don't stand by their political platform. So for young lesbians who do not have any place to meet, it's like everybody is on their own, and then you get vulnerable. Also, it's like no one of us, like my generation and new generations, knew anything about the political impact lesbian feminists had in the 1970s and 1980s. We didn't know actually they existed, and therefore when I now have met them, and I met a woman called Inge Aas, and we are writing a book. She's the author, I'm the editor, and it's called We Ate, Slept and Drank Feminism. And by being part of this project, that is why I met all these second wave lesbians who together with other women changed Norway and made it a better country for women. And to give these arguments, their resistance, the name calling and the mansplaining the lesbians met in the 80s, 70s is not so different from today's situation. So this book is relevant and necessary to make art and books about the history, so it's delivered to next generations, is really important, because if we don't know the history, we all have to start on blank in some ways. I hope lesbian feminists in all countries can make books and films, documentaries about all the experience and the actual history, what happened, because then we don't have to invent everything every time we meet this kind of hostility towards feminism and womanhood.
As far as face-to-face personal community goes, I guess there isn't much around these days, but as far as ideas and knowing each other and resistance to, well, the transgender thing, but also to male supremacy in general, and also the connections between women, I think that's I was going to say still there, but I think I don't know that I can say still, because I think there was a great interregnum when there wasn't any, but it seems to be happening again, and this webinar is one example of it. The meanings and the values of lesbian feminism are still there. Even though perhaps the personal interactions are not. I mean, we don't have the demonstrations anymore. We don't have the places where we used to go anymore. But then community is not always a comfortable place anyway. As a sociologist, I'm somewhat ambivalent about community. I mean, on the one hand, on the one hand, it's good because you've got the belonging and the recognition and the companionship, but on the other hand, it can also be very confining and mean a whole lot of pressure too. But I think it's still around, mainly I guess on social media, vile though Facebook might be. But certainly, I've come across any number of women, lesbians, who share the same meanings and values that I do. So I think it's still there, even if it's not on a personal level.
Having lived at the height of the lesbian feminist movement and community, we've lost a lot since then. We've lost our institutions, our bookstores, our coffee houses, our concerts, our festivals, and even our bars that predated lesbian feminism, but still were places for women to go with, for all their faults. Lesbian feminist on the ground political activism is mostly non-existent, though I am hopeful we'll be able to recreate it through this process that we're involved in today. But young lesbian feminists are few in number, and they are extremely isolated. Most young women who would have been lesbian feminists in the past, 3 decades ago, have transitioned or are caught up in the disguised compulsory heterosexuality of their queer and trans communities, or they are simply living straight lives. Lesbians have been erased from our history. They're being either ignored or transed. And the LGBTQIA plus, whatever it is no longer recognizable from the movement that we knew and that we were involved in creating. The lesbian feminist community, or what's left of it, is aging and have been iced out of their own community centers and other community spaces and are now meeting in each other's homes, which I highly recommend. Because there's nothing like face-to-face. We can't do it now with COVID, but it's real important that we start meeting women-only meetings in our homes, which we can still do. But we've lost a lot, and the most important thing to me is to be able to communicate and to have that intergenerational sharing of information and experiences so that women do not have to reinvent the wheel, and we can regain what we lost.
The lesbian feminist culture has been lost and colonized by queer and transgender people. In Spain, we have a dictatorship until 1975. But in the 80s, for example, there were the Madrid Feminist Lesbians Collective, Feministas Lesbianas de Madrid, founded among other women by the lesbian feminist Vito Virtudes, which was very important at that time, but currently there are no spaces for lesbian feminists other than LGBT spaces, since the foreground feminism or the mainstream feminist movement and gender critical movement I think is profoundly heterosexist and does not take into account the analysis of lesbian feminism, which is why, in my opinion, by making this analysis invisible, we haven't been able to face transgenderism. In conclusion, I believe that the analysis of lesbian feminism are the only ones capable of opposing the transgender narrative, but here in Spain, they are generally unknown and very invisible. I recommend reading The Lesbian Revolution, Lesbian Feminism in the UK from Sheila Jeffries, which could be useful to understand what happened with lesbian feminist community in the recent decades. It could be useful to understand also what happened in other countries, but there is no counterpart book like this in Spain.
Lesbian only and women only spaces are closing. Action is now happening online. I cannot say much on this because I don't use social media, but I hear that a lot of lesbians think that activism is something you do on Facebook. I think that carrying out political action online is fine, but cannot be the all and end all of political activity. Participating in a group is essential. We have seen during COVID lockdown how human contact is a primary and primal need. In Italy, especially in larger towns, commercial venues have replaced more grassroots places. It is no longer enough to offer separatist space and good company and lesbians often look for something more sleek and fashionable. Grassroots places are seen as out of date and highbrow. I think that in actual fact, lesbians still need exactly the sort of company and support grassroots initiative can offer, but there is a prejudice to be overcome. Another problem we are facing is that more and more women and girls identify as queer instead of lesbian. Queer is seen as a more inclusive term. During my life, I heard all sorts of reasons not to use that word. Now, the queer academia has given a new, cool excuse to avoid it. This obsession on being inclusive shows lack of a political insight. In a world divided by oppression, it is certainly important to forge alliances, but you have to acknowledge that there are conflicts and that you cannot include everyone. Otherwise, you will not build an effective movement for change. This obsession for being inclusive is a trend particularly in the women movement, as if women could be dissolved and anyone could take their place. No one applies the same compulsory inclusiveness in the Black movement or in the socialist movement. We are told that women do not exist, that we are only a narrative, but of course the so-called trans women are very real. Very often, queer activists also forget lesbians are in an inherently intersectional position. That is why I have no patience for queer activists, often straight women or gay men in academia, who want to teach us condescendingly and reproachfully about being intersectional. And they explain it wrongly because they use the word as if it simply meant inclusive. As lesbian, we have a lot of experience about intersectionality. If before the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, Black lesbians were focusing on the interlocking oppression they were facing. As Archilesbica in Milan, we now have a group of very young migrant lesbians. A lot could be said about the experience of these lesbians. Many have gone through the Libyan camps and crossed the sea on small dangerous boats. As far as I know, it is the only group of this kind in Italy, but queers conveniently overlook this important group.